Welcome to Policy Drivers, the video podcast where we have a chance to talk to leaders in planning and policy who are helping make Texas a better place to live. Today, we have a chance to talk with Oni Blair, who is a public policy professional working in international, national, and local issues. Oni serves as executive director of LINKHouston, a nonprofit organization that advocates for equity in transportation so that all people can reach opportunity. Leveraging community engagement and data analysis, LINKHouston works to ensure better transit, improve safety and accessibility for people walking and biking, and keep communities united in the face of highway infrastructure development. Oni is a member of the Mayor's Bicycle Advisory Committee and a voting member of the Houston-Galveston Area Council's Technical Advisory Committee, which evaluates regional planning, regional transportation plans, and makes recommendations to the Metropolitan Planning Organization's Policy Council. Welcome, Oni. How are you?
Hi, thanks for having me here today.
Is there anything that we missed in your intro that you would like to include?
No, that's more than enough. Thank you.
So we're going to get started with some general policy questions about being a policy professional. What do you wish that someone had told you when you were first getting started in public policy?
That's a great question, and one that I think about a lot, because when I was in graduate school, as many of the interns at Farm&City are in right now, I was overwhelmed. I went straight from undergrad to graduate school and didn't have a lot of work experience. And I would be asked questions in class about what would the US government do in this scenario, or what would this agency do in that scenario, or what should this community do in this scenario? And I always felt like everyone had all the answers. And it wasn't until really the end of my graduate school career and going into my professional career that I discovered that people don't have the answers. What makes them policy professionals is knowing where to look for the answers and how to find professionals with the answers. And discovering that, unfortunately too late for graduate school, but in time for the real world, was really helpful. And it helps to take away the fear of doing something new. You don't have to know all the answers. And especially as a policy professional, you're not there to know all the answers. You're there to be able to understand how things intersect. You're there to ask the right questions and to make sure that the people who are looking at it from a scientific or technical aspect are not ignoring the social and environmental and economic impacts, that they're not building on past legacies of discrimination and racism, and are taking into account what the real world is. It's often in academia of tremendous success in producing amazing ideas. They're produced in isolation. The job of a policy professional is to be able to ask the right questions and put all of these together in a way that is actually helpful for the public.
That's some really great advice for me specifically, because I did go straight from undergrad into grad school, so I'm a little on the younger side, and I don't have that professional experience apart from any interns that might have. Yeah, that's really useful for me personally, but I know like that just is a generally good skill to have, knowing, you know, where do I go to find these things? I don't know what to do in this situation, and I don't know the answers here, but somebody somewhere has done some research on this and has come up with at least part of the answer, and then learning how to synthesize that. So that's a great skill to develop, I think, for grad school, but also the world in general. What advice do you think would be most important for people entering the field in the next few months or years, including myself and other interns?
For people entering the policy field, looking at public policy, public affairs, is really, we are at a unique time when people have introduced the word of intersectionality, and often they mean it in terms of personal identity, but the word can be applied to really anything. It is that intersection of multiple things in life, and we are often tempted to just look at the lane in which we are currently working and to ignore all the other pieces. But as we see looking around us, you know, what happens in foreign policy in countries affects us directly. There are no barriers or borders that prevent a pandemic or climate change from affecting us, and the impacts are seen in everything, including transportation, who has access to go wait in their car to go get a COVID-19 test, and reminding people that not everybody has a car to go wait in for food distribution. People aren't thinking about that who work on hunger or on pandemics, but they've created a barrier that is in a completely different sector that they feel that they have nothing to do with unintentionally. And the role, I think, of policy professionals going forward is to understand that these artificial barriers between domestic and different sectors, even within those, have to come down, and that we're going to need to talk more and be willing to read more and understand more and to communicate more about how those things at the global and even national level affect us locally. One of the things I find in my work is that it is difficult to talk to people about transportation. You know, our organization, LINKHouston, focuses on advocacy and transportation. And very intentionally, our mission is around access to opportunity, and remind people that there are lots of organizations that focus on investments in education and investments in job training and investments in health and healthcare. But none of those matter if you can't get there. And so somebody has to focus on what this other barrier is, which is transportation. And that is just one example of what all of us are going to have to do in this new world, in which it's more apparent. It's always been there, but it's definitely more apparent that there's intersectionality across sectors, and we are going to have to understand what those are and still be experts in whatever it is our field is, but recognize that we need to lean and integrate our work into other fields. And that includes, going back to what I said earlier, on racism and historical racism and systemic barriers, and being able to acknowledge and point to what those are in order to actually ensure that the benefits that we're developing in public policy can reach everyone, and that we're doing extra to overcome the barriers for communities of color that have been left out historically.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that the world of policy needs to be more holistic and more kind of like an all-around approach to, you know, whatever a person's specific policy interest or expertise is, needs to also be considering what other factors it impacts. Like somebody who doesn't work in transportation still needs to be thinking about transportation for all those reasons that you said. And, you know, specifically with that frame in mind, that not everything is that is meant to be equal access actually has equal access. And I found myself running into this a lot when I was trying to write an op-ed over the last week, thinking about equity in transportation decision making and how that touched on and everything else, right? Like environmental racism and how the transportation sector is disproportionately producing pollution that affects minority communities, and you know, that has something to do with transportation decision making, as well as you know, who can actually access public transit, and where does public transit go, and how many stops are there, and what directions in the city is it prioritizing. Like in Austin, we have a really bad problem getting east-west or like from East Austin to Central Austin on public transit because of the history and the city's history with redlining and I-35 and segregation. And so it just restricts access for a lot of folks. So I think that's really important. What do you most often wish that people who are not involved in the transit world, like the general public or other policy professionals, understood better about the transit world?
For transit in particular, I just wish people would try it. I mean, I wish I had something cooler to say, but you know, I find myself in these really interesting conversations. My colleague Ines, who works on the communication side of our team, she and I have gone to go talk to a number of funders and just different organizations together from different walks of life, and we've been in environments where we were briefing all women who lived in one of the toniest neighborhoods in Houston, and another situation where we were briefing next generation donors, so people who were either inherited wealth or are really fast entrepreneurs who made a lot of wealth quickly and are learning how to manage their philanthropies. And in all of those situations, they were very open to listening to us. But what I found was something that resonated with them was not talking about transit in Houston, but reminding them that they've all ridden transit before in other places, in Washington, in New York, in Paris, in London. And to think that it actually might be a similar experience here in Houston was a little bit mind-boggling to them. But once we talked through it, they're like, oh yeah, we do have it here. And we could write it, and people do write it. And then to go to the extra mile and to ask questions and recognize that people all around them use it, the people who help watch their children and work with them on their teams, whether that be in their house or otherwise. And that sort of making it relevant to people means that they understand that it could be a part of their lives. Whether they choose to use it, really, that's a separate question, but it shouldn't be cut off, and it should be an option. And there are people who want to and do use it for a wide variety of reasons. And so for those who don't ride transit, I would just say, just try it. You might be surprised.
Yeah, I agree with you. As an undergrad at UT, I didn't have a car, and so the bus is just how I got around. And I just remember, because UT IDs let you ride the buses for free if you swipe your ID. So I just remember trying to convince any and everybody, why not use the bus? You don't have to pay for a Lyft or an Uber. You can get on the bus and it's free. And people are like, oh, I don't know how to use it, or I don't want to take the time to learn, or is it just slow? And this emphasis on the quickness of where you can get someplace, instead of maybe just saying, it's easier for me to, I have my hands free. I don't have to deal with the dangers of traffic or the dangers of cars. It's really a wonderful thing. I loved getting on the bus in the morning, and even though it probably took me 5 minutes longer than if I was going to drive to my jobs, but in a car, I got to put my headphones in and listen to music and kind of people watch. And I think it's a really transformative experience to just be around other people and not be so isolated in your vehicle. And I agree with you. I really wish that people would give it more of a chance and not just be like, oh,
So Tynan, you actually just touched on something that is a soft spot for me, which is the costs in comparing it, and the time in comparing it. So as personal background, I also didn't have a car for a really, really, really long time. So I remember in high school, I had a job. My job in my high school was across the street from my dad's work. So I would just catch a ride with him or would walk home. And then in college, I did not have a car, and it was very much a land grant school, huge campus. And people were like, how do you get anywhere? I'm like, the bus or walking, or I hitch a ride with a friend, because I don't really want to spend my money on a car. I was dead set on not having any debt when I graduated, and was successful in doing that. But by not having a car, I was able to afford some other opportunities. And in grad school too, I realized I was still not going to have a car, and that if I got an apartment in front of a bus stop, because I couldn't afford to live across from the train, that I could still get by for 2 more years. And then by the time I graduated from grad school and I had a job, I was like, wait a second, I don't have this thing as an albatross around my neck that's going to cost me. I can actually think about owning a house and limiting my car input. So I eventually got a car in my mid-20s after I'd already started working. And I have had one car for my entire life, which I am not that young anymore. but my family now, my husband and I and my kids, we share a car. Not everybody can do that, I recognize. But as a result, we use that money for lots of other things. And for time, I compare, that time that I use, and at first blanch, it may seem longer to be on transit to get to the destination. But the reality is, on a campus, you're just comparing your time to get to campus. You still have to park and walk a mile to get to your building, which I guarantee you is still going to be the same amount of time. My office now for LINKHouston, when we went to the office, we haven't been to the office since early March, is downtown. For me, even when my bus is late, and I find that really annoying, frankly, by the time I go to my house, go park somewhere, spend, anywhere between $5 and $20 to go park, and then still I have to get on the train to take the train into my office from where I park, I might as well have just waited for the train, because I've done it and timed it. And the reality is I save like 10 minutes by doing it that way. But at that point, the whole stress of going through that whole rigmarole, I might as well have just waited. So it's you have to compare like the entire trip for the time, and not just the part where you decided to like park, because there's still, especially in highly dense areas and areas where we're trying to reach, a long way to go. Anyway, all that to say is, yes, there are many reasons and many interests. On a personal level, the financial one is one that appealed to me, and that's not everyone's, but it's one that I think is really important on the scheme of things, especially in thinking about long-term finances and wealth and other ways to invest.
Yeah, I'm completely with you. And you have the flexibility of just getting on a bus and going pretty much anywhere in the city, like within your vicinity, and not having to worry about going back for your car later. Like if you want to go hang out with your friends somewhere else, and there's no guarantee that there's going to be parking, especially in Austin, even at places that have parking lots. So yeah, I think that it's something that more people should try.
So therein lies the challenge, is that ideally, yes, that is the case where you have lots of options on where to reach. The challenge is, and this is part of our work on equity, is that many communities, that lack of investment means that those choices that I am able to make just don't exist, because there is no bus, or there is no cross-section of buses that allow you to get to where you're going. And so then you're forced to own a vehicle, whether that's something you want to do, or whether it's something that even makes sense for you to do. And that is where the equity piece comes into play.
Yeah, exactly. How is working in policy in the aspect that you do different from working in policy in another role?
So I think the way that most people view it is that a nonprofit is often not involved in policy, and policymakers are elected officials or bureaucrats. Mm-hmm. And the reality is that in any sector, there are people outside of those official roles who are holding those official roles accountable and ensuring that they're being transparent and ensuring that what they're doing is impacting positively communities. And so our role as a nonprofit that focuses on equity and transportation is we are trying to produce the data-informed research and work with communities who are directly talking about their experiences that inform those decisions by policymakers and hold them accountable to what the reality is. If they say they're going to improve and I am showing you you're not, based on community members' feedback and the data-informed research that shows that their stories are not outliers, but truly eliminating what is happening systemically, that is a role of the policy world from the outside, the person who's not in the seat, not elected, not in the government position. And it is just as important, because you have to hold decision makers accountable, and you have to make sure that their work is transparent. I think that's the other part of the role of nonprofit world and think tanks is whatever role you fall in, C3, C4, whatever, is the transparency piece. And government should be transparent, but the reality is they're not. And so being able to ask what you believe is the right question to be asking and measuring it and showing that information publicly and sharing it far and wide is also part of shaping that policy field.
Yeah, and being accountable to the community because you care about the community, and not accountable to which people in the community are going to vote, and then what do they care about, and then what can I do to make those people happy so that I get reelected. So it kind of frees you up to be more holistic and to understand the needs of the community as a whole, especially those communities that are disenfranchised or don't have access to voter ID or other things like that keep them from being the voters that public officials care about.
I had a question as well, off of what you said about government not being transparent enough. And I know one of my little passion projects, I guess, is the importance of understandable information. And I give August a hard time about this sometimes. Transportation has a lot of like specific terms or initials that no one understands unless you have trained in it. And I know every discipline is guilty of this because we had the same thing when I was working in natural resources. But how much would you say that like lack of transparency is in some part caused by specialized, unapproachable vocabulary that like could just be totally comprehensible to people if you said it in words that they can understand?
You said it in real language.
Yes.
And multiple languages. I think that is one part of it, and I used to believe that sometimes it was accidental, but positive that is done quite intentionally, especially now. I think that is one aspect of the transparency is the language that's used. And one of the things that I find is having a good mix of diversity on your team of experiences helps to ensure that you're kind of overcoming that transparency. Doesn't mean that you have to dumb down the language by any means, but just how you explain it. Even if you do use the jargon, sometimes I think it's appropriate and helpful and educational to use jargon intentionally so that people can, when you're there, to be able to understand what someone else is talking about, but making sure you're explaining it. So, putting in the term and then putting a comma and saying, or in other words, this means da-da-da-da-da-da, comma, and then going on with your sentence. Something as simple as that helps people to connect dots for what you're talking about in this context and them understanding it and what they see later on that's posted on a website by the government that is not explained, but then they don't miss it. They know what terms to look for. They know what Google alerts to set. They know that when there's a meeting posted that, oh, you're talking about that thing that we need to be focused on.
Yeah, because I know definitely, sorry.
So sorry. The next question I wanted to ask you is about challenges. Just what are some of the biggest challenges that the Houston area or all of Texas is facing to improve public transportation and accessibility?
Well, if you had asked me that question a month ago, let me address it specific to public transit, and then I think we should talk about on equity as a related but somewhat different question as well. On public transit, if you had asked me that question, not a month ago, if you had asked me 6 months ago, I probably would have had a different answer. But right now, I think one of the biggest challenges for public transit is from the non-user side, this idea that public transit is now outdated and the place where you're going to catch COVID-19 and has no future. And I think from the user side, the reality is that there are a lot of people who still use transit, even today. Mm-hmm. And they are using it to often be on the front lines of the fight against COVID-19, from going to the Texas Medical Center. And Metro's data shows that a lot of its trips are still headed to the Texas Medical Center. So Metro being the public transit authority for the Houston area. Mm-hmm. And even their commuter bus, the park and ride, as we call it in our area, almost half of those trips, even during COVID-19 times, are headed to the Texas Medical Center. And a lot of people are just getting groceries, or going to go work at grocery stores. That's not going to change. So whatever evolves, I think the biggest challenge is realizing that it's not public transit that's the problem. It's the ability to control and to prevent the spread of any virus or sickness is the challenge. And the same challenges that we're going to be addressing in the school place, in the workplace, are the ones that we're going to be addressing on public transit. So the appropriate measures to protect yourself and others, we have to take seriously. And we're going to need to think about those. And we do need to think about what the future of transit is. Recognizing we will still have to have a way to move people in mass, not only for economics, but also for climate impact. Those will still have to be invested in equitably for climate justice, for equity in economics and social access and access to opportunity. And there are lots of ways that we can take the transit as we see it today and move it to the next level, including some easy investments on how often buses go. You know, the gut is that people aren't going to use it, so we need to reduce, we have to take away the fares and run less buses. But what that has meant also is that people are standing at bus stops for hours because the buses are full.
Yeah.
And they're late for work,
Yeah.
you know? And so there's the reality is like, we got to think a little bit beyond what we have now. And we're going to need investments from the federal and state levels in order to be able to do that.
Yeah.
We can't build enough highways to carry everybody to where they're going to go in the next even 10 years. So we've got to think more broadly.
Yeah, we've been fighting that a lot at Farm&City with the just kind of the common misperception that if you just build more frontage roads and you just widen the highways, that the congestion will go away, but it won't. And we've seen that over and over again. It doesn't go away. There just has to be more ways that people can get around other than, you know, one person per car and a bajillion cars on the road. And you touched on this a little bit, but LINKHouston advocates for robust and equitable transportation network. What are the main policy goals that LINK is currently focusing on, and what are some of the major projects that will help meet those goals?
So when we first launched only 3 years ago, we very much focused on the different modes of transportation. So looking at equity in access to high quality public transit. Our Equity in Transit report in 2018 not only identified where there were lacking investments in public transit, but also where they were most needed based on density of people who need transit access, especially for economic, social reasons. That report also included a number of recommendations that were based on the frequency of transit, accessibility for people with disabilities, around the span of service, and the reliability. And those recommendations, a majority of them made it into the $7 billion long-term plan for our public transit authority. And moving forward, that happened not only with research, but a lot of community engagement, organizing communities geographically and based on interest. So having the disability community come out and stand before Metro and illuminate what that data says so that people could understand on a very real level what it meant and how the impact would influence communities. Moving forward, we're still focused on that equitable implementation of that plan that is very much underway. Even in the COVID times, it's slowed down, but it's still happening. Now I would kind of lump all of those efforts into a mobility effort. So we've also done similar work with communities and data-informed research that led the mayor of Houston to understand the real danger of walking and biking in Houston, and disproportionately on communities of color. Black people are almost killed twice at the rate of their population in Houston while walking. So we're about 19, I'm African American, I'm Black. For those who may be listening to the podcast, 19% of the population in Houston, but it's almost 40% in 2016, 2017, 2018 data that are killed walking, of the people who were killed walking. And pretty much, you know, nationwide, this is true, but it's still true in Houston, 2% of the crashes involve people walking and biking, but they can comprise about 25% of those who are actually killed. That is also an inequity in the mode of transportation and the need. So our work led the mayor to not only call for the most dangerous intersections, he then, using our research and research that we partnered with Bike Houston, recognized the most dangerous intersections for people walking and biking, and then went on to address the most immediate needs in them. And that helped to feed into a broader commitment that became the Vision Zero campaign in Houston to call for 0 fatalities by 2030 that builds on a lot of the work that Farm&City has done statewide and locally, not only as Farm&City, but in its predecessor, Jay's work here to recognize the impact and the need. And that's a public health crisis, but it's also just a crisis. It's a crisis of people getting killed. And it's one that people say, you know, is about the luxury and recreation of being able to walk and bike. And I think our work and the work of Farm&City and some other groups has really put a light on that, shine a light on it to show that it's not just about people being able to take a joyride on Sunday morning. Like, people are going to work. Yeah. People are going to school. You know, there are policies that limit access for buses to generally most students don't have access to a bus if they live within 2 miles of the school. Well, my parents always worked, and I'm very thankful that my parents were employed, and that's not everyone's situation, but I will say my parents were not at home to take me to school, almost ever. I always had to get to school walking or biking or walking to the bus to go to school. And so I just cannot imagine that this is not important for access to everything. And then similarly, one of the things that we've worked on has been access to opportunity and the impact that overinvestment in highways has put and the burden that is shed. So in Houston, much like the I-35 conversation in Austin, we have the North Houston Highway Improvement Project, the NHHIP, which, getting back to, you know, the jargon versus the vernacular, to Madeline's question, you know, I always put in parentheses the I-45 North expansion, because that's what people know it as, not searching or knowing to search for NHHIP in an agenda, because it's never listed as the I-45 expansion in an official government document, which means that that's what you're looking for. You always miss it. Trust me, I have missed it in an agenda the first and second time looking for those terms instead of looking for the North Houston Highway Improvement Project. That project is actually already underway, and it is a $7 to $10 billion project that will expand the highway from downtown Houston to north to Greenspoint. The communities it impacts range from 67% to 90% communities of color. And this is according to Texas Department of Transportation's own studies, their draft environmental impact statement, which also identifies that over 1,000 homes, both multifamily and single family units, will be displaced by the project as it currently stands. So our work is very much focused on mitigating that disproportionate burden of that project, the inequity of that project that falls on communities of color. We all recognize highway needs to be improved, and that needs to happen, and it needs to be safer. It's been without maintenance for many, many, many years. Yeah. We but can not still not at the expense of communities of color, and that doesn't mean that the improvements can't happen. It's understanding what those improvements are and focusing on the interest that is shared behind those improvements. So moving people, not cars, moving people faster and safer. There are a lot more people who travel in different modes and who aren't even necessarily in a car. And the car is not what we value, it's the people that we value. So there are ways to move the people safely and more of them quickly without expanding the width of the highway, without displacing cultural sites, including a church that's in the very first freedmen's town in the state of Texas, without increasing flooding by excessive amounts of concrete, without adding problems to the air quality that already disproportionately impacts communities of color in our city. So our work has gone to focus on that and improving what that looks like so that people actually benefit who live next to it and aren't just suffering the burdens of that project. It is a long road to do something like that. And I don't know if we'll be successful. I do know that in the process that we have gotten the mayor to think thoughtfully, to engage in a year-long community process that's resulted in him officially changing his mind and sharing a new vision with the Texas Transportation Commission. We've worked intensely with communities and excellent organizations like Air Alliance Houston and the Make I-45 Better Coalition, and even the Stop TxDOT I-45 group, which we don't agree on everything, but we all know we're allies in this work, and have mobilized dozens of people, hundreds of people to be involved in this, resulting in 5 hours of conversation and public comment last year at the Houston-Galveston Area Council, our Metropolitan Planning Organization that controls billions of dollars in transportation funds. That resulted in $51.5 million being won for communities of color along the side of the project. And more recently, including this morning actually, pushing back on that same body as they move forward on the project and have led us to a point where now that body has agreed to form a memorandum of understanding between the main stakeholders, including the City of Houston, Harris County, the Public Transit Authority Metro, and the Texas Department of Transportation, which it's to be seen whether that memorandum of understanding will result in the mitigations that we're seeking to improve the project for the communities that we've talked about. But it's a step that didn't exist before, and it's a step that has TxDOT has taken and through local agreements in the past in other communities, but never on, as far as I've seen, on a major project like this, and especially in the Houston area. So in addition to that, now we've kind of lumped all of our work into a mobility phase, and moving forward, we've started to align our work also with access to opportunity and produced a big report with the Rice University's Institute for Kinder Institute for Urban Research that focused on affordable housing and transportation, aligning what that looks like for recommendations for policymakers and showing geographically how the disalignment means that affordable housing, generally, if you live in affordable housing in Houston, you don't have access to affordable transportation, and making recommendations and tools for improvement of that in the future. And also realizing that all of this has an impact on our climate. And so as we look forward, working on climate justice together.
Well, congratulations on all of the wins and successes that you've had, and we wish you luck in fighting for the ones that you're still in the progress of doing. We wanted to ask you about Vision Zero, and I think before we do that, Madeline has a question she wants to jump in.
I had a question. I had a chance to watch that H-GAC meeting this morning, and it seemed really great that they were forming a task force in order to create that memorandum of understanding, but there was a little bit of disagreement among the body about what would be the best way to organize that, and they sort of said they were going to decide in the August meeting. So I think perhaps what is your pie in the sky dream vision about how that would sort of turn out from a perspective of LINKHouston or some of the communities in that area?
That's a great question, Madeline. The short version of it is that memorandum of understanding, that body that controls the funding that they approved, they said that there would be 5 parties, and as I named them earlier, City of Houston, Harris County, Texas Department of Transportation, Metro, which is the public transit, and the Houston-Galveston Area Council. But what the chair to that body named 16 people to be a part of that memorandum of understanding conversation, of which half or more are not any of those parties to the agreement, nor do they represent communities adjacent to the project. They are disproportionately representatives that come from communities that are not touching the project and are much wider than the communities that are impacted by the project. So ideally, the project would be limited to, just the discussion would be really limited to the parties to the agreement, and it should be a transparent process, so anybody would have access to it no matter what. Additionally, that group would stay focused on what the issues are at hand, which is talking about the displacement, the flooding, the air quality, the green space access, and of course the safety. There's a lot that was implied in the conversation this morning at the Houston-Galveston Area Council, and so it's unclear what they think their writ may be, but they need to stay focused on that. There are a couple of entities that were named to that it does make sense for them to be there. But the ones that are geographically representing communities afar field who may or may not use I-45 and having those be the majority of the people at the table makes no sense to me. And that was reflected not only by our organization, but by a number of community members who participated in public comment today.
Yeah, so to any viewers, catch up next month about, or in August, at the August meeting, about how that develops.
Can I just say something that you mentioned, the $51 million, and that's a monumental thing. Like that hadn't happened in that way at a Texas MPO and so it's just important to note what a big deal that was that you guys got that, and that basically using MPO money to pay for a real community-based process. And then two, to say we will do the mitigation that you come up with it hopefully will be seen as the first of the way we do things now. But as far as I know, it's never been done.
I think Jay,
sorry, Ani, can you to what you were just saying and Madeline, your question, Ani, can you tie in the whole system change, which is such an part of our work? It's we can really demonstrate it through our work. Find this.
That's a great point. Systems change, and gets back to what Jay was talking about. All of this is new. The memorandum of understanding and getting them to systems and understanding when and trying to be sure that that is not the only time that it happens, but how do you change a system in order that you can reach that place again and go beyond it, and that you're changing who has the decision, how the decision-making process is different, who has a seat at the table, how many people have a seat at the table. And so in addition to the work that we're doing, that's more on the forefront of this conversation and very specific to the North Houston Highway Improvement Project, we're also using this opportunity of finally being on the Transportation Advisory Committee, so kind of the deputies of that planning body, to change what that looks like and change that system. And so I have been a voting member on that body for a year and a half. And when I got on, I volunteered for both the bylaws committee and the nominations committee very intentionally. And by getting on the bylaws committee, there were 2 women of like 8 of us. Usually I was the only person of color fighting for who can be on the subcommittees and how many people. And meaning we were changing the rules for how many advocates and people who were not a management district or a tax incremental redevelopment zone, a TERS district participant, or an elected official, participant from a bureaucratic body, but that there are a lot of other people who have information that's useful for decision making. So we did that. So changing the rules for who had a seat at the table at that voting body and all the subcommittees, and then also on the nominating committee, nominating new faces. So last year we were quite successful, and I think got 12 people successfully nominated to subcommittees. This year we got 23 last count, 23. All but 21 of them are women and people of color. Wow. Many of them are management district leaders, but from communities that people have never had a seat on subcommittees, right? It's like they don't exist, but they hold the same jobs as people from other management districts and tax incremental redevelopment zones, and community leaders who work on everything from public health and look at transportation as a social determinant of health, and are always looking at transportation access to people who work on all different sorts of issues and understand and have something to bring to the table. And another part of that is changing the rules and access is we changed the rules who has a position on the transportation improvement project. So these are the actual projects that are grants that get funded. So that has a subcommittee, and that subcommittee basically writes the rules for scoring for projects. And before you had to be an implementing entity, meaning you had to be able to actually physically do the infrastructure project to be considered for that committee. We changed that, and now we're on that body, which means we'll be able to help change the rules. And it's not going to be easy or a short thing, but change the rules for how that scoring works. And hopefully that will change who gets to be scored and successful in a project that's funded by our regional entity. All of that matters, because if we want to change, who's appointed to a committee that's controlling a $7 billion project, you have to change who's around the table making those appointments.
I had a question that I really was curious to ask you and talk to you about. It is related but a little bit different. So I just wanted to ask about your experience when you were abroad. So you were representative of the U.S. In Pakistan, Jordan, Iraq. How has your experience abroad changed your perspective on planning in the U.S.? Like, what are some of the unique ways that we do planning and engagement here in the U.S. and in Texas? And what can those differences teach us about how to plan here?
So that's a great question. So just backing up a step, I was a Foreign Service officer, which means I was an American diplomat, and I worked both in Washington and overseas. And I think that for often people are like, wait, what? How did you get from transportation to this? And part of that is a lot of the work is the same. We talked about policy access and what that means, and policy, public policy and public policy planning. First and foremost, a lot of it revolves around understanding access to opportunity and human rights. So my job and many of those roles, especially in Washington and in Iraq, had to do with working with communities that have been left behind, communities of color, and communities that were underrepresented in government and in policy making, and in the Middle East and South Asia. And the really understanding what the barriers were for them to access, especially education, housing, and jobs. And that is, we use different vernacular in those spaces overseas as we do locally, but the issues are the same. And I would also point out that in many countries and territories, that communities there, actually the leaders have often studied the civil rights movement in the United States. And so as a Black diplomat, I would have this really weird and interesting conversation with you. I remember with people, and I remember one time a Palestinian leader pulled me aside and she's like, I want you to know that I've studied Black feminism from the civil rights movement, and that was what my thesis was about. And I use that as a basis for our work, because it is so important that we stay focused on peaceful civilian movements and accessing rights. And I think that, to your question, August, and in my opinion, is that we try to have this big separation from what we do internationally, from what we do locally, and especially what we do in Houston and Texas. That just doesn't exist. It just doesn't. And there's so much overlap in our work. There's so much overlap in the reality that what happens in access and every single right has an impact on all of us to live full lives. And on the flip side, bringing it back home to Houston, one of the things that I used to work on also was the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which, talking about the UN or anything international from an international organization, is very frowned upon in Texas, and especially in Houston, extremely. Like, I've had people literally tell me, don't talk about that. You will lose funding. You will have people coming after you. But the reality is, like, again, the UN Sustainable Development Goals have number 11, which is on sustainable cities, and target number 2 is literally on equity and transportation. We did not make this up. People all over the world are dealing with this, and people all over the world, 100 and almost 90 countries involved in entities involved in negotiations in 2014 and 2015 recognized that having access to transportation radically changes people's lives and their outcomes. And so what I learned from that experience and this experience is that our experiences in Houston, as much as we want to think they are unique, are not unique. We need to be realistically tying them to this greater system that exists everywhere, that this barrier of transportation impacts our lives and whether we are able to live full, amazing lives that we choose, or if we're going to be cut off from opportunities.
I think that that your point about extrapolating from other countries, what we could do better here, is really a goal that I wish we did more in the United States. Just understanding that we are not the exception, and there are things that have worked in other places that just because they're other countries doesn't mean that they're not implementable here, and that can teach us so much if we're willing to learn from it. I think we're out of time, but I really want to thank you for coming on, both of you, Oni and Ines, for being a part of this conversation with us. Your insights have been invaluable and really interesting, and we really enjoyed having you on.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks, Tynan. Thanks, Jay.
Thanks for being here.
Signing off.